job, right, of an ordinary clerk working for a vast bureaucracy. In a lot of ways, I think Death's relationship to her job is similar to Yvonne's relationship to his job as a judge, right? It is purely rational. It is disinterested. It is devoid of any feeling and emotion. And because of that, right, it is, well, monotonous, repetitive, and ultimately devoid of a pathos. What were you going to say, Sam?
I was just gonna say that, like, we all like to death in this very sad way, because, like,
Yeah.
it's a very personal thing, and, like, dying is kind of scary, but, like, it does happen every day, and, like, I think the point of making it this kind of bureaucratic thing that just is so normal is kind of indicative of the way that death is so normal and
Yeah.
happens to everyone.
I agree. So the idea that death is commonplace is something that, of course, is emphasized by this description. It is reduced, right, from sort of the level of tragedy to the level of, well, farce.
We also spoke last week about potentially how death's life is devoid of meaning or purpose.
Yes. Yes.
And that, like, the characterization of death's work as one of repetition, that Saramago's doing, like, a really interesting thing by making death's life meaningless.
Which, of course, is a contradiction in terms, but for the time being, let's just try to stick with it. In other words, death in her existence seems to be devoid of meaning and purpose. She has no relationship to the human beings that she kills, right? In other words, to her, they're not individual human beings. To her, they're simply, well, the subject matter of her job, right? It's a matter of paperwork for death. She's the one who sends out letters, and those letters, of course, are letters that announce that the person in question has a week to live. So in other words, the process of death is turned into almost a bureaucratic process, right? A process that involves paperwork, but once again is devoid of any personal relationship between death and her victims. Yes?
Oh, I was just going to say, I feel like when she starts sending out the letters is when she kind of starts to have feeling for human beings. Like, because doesn't she do it kind of out of compassion? Like, trying to give them time to, like, get their affairs in order before they go instead of just, like, killing them.
So there's a change in procedure, right? Usually death arrives unannounced. However, Saramago imagines a world where immortality has been reinstated, right? But now the characters of the novel have a week's warning before they are visited by death. How do people react to this advanced warning about their impending death? Does anybody remember?
Well, death has the intention that they'll use it to get their taxes in order, say goodbye to their family, write
Right.
their will, but they instead just engage in debauchery,
Right.
go out, do a bunch of crazy stuff because they know they're going to die anyways.
Yeah, in other words, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? In other words, those who receive the letter, not everyone, but the majority of people, seem to indulge in vices, right? Vices that otherwise they would have perhaps abstained from for a variety of reasons. So what did we say about morality in that particular context? Why do people seem to engage in illegal and also immoral behavior when they know that they're going to die?
Well, I thought it was interesting that we pointed out last time that it's not that they know they're going to die; it's that they know when they're going to die.
Yeah.
That makes them have this behavior,
Excellent.
and they're so they're I guess it's this. They've lost this one uncertainty. There's this one uncertainty that they could rely on before that they don't have anymore. So they're just there's almost less control then, and they want to there's no point to in not doing whatever they want, and they're from that point of view maybe.
So, in other words, fear of consequences, right, is removed. In other words, one of the things that happens when people find out that they're going to die is that they no longer fear the consequences of their actions, which makes them act in ways that otherwise they wouldn't have necessarily allowed themselves to do. Inhibitions are lowered precisely because there is no longer fear of consequences. In my other course in magical realism, we're right now reading a novel by Cincinnatus called Invitation to a Beheading. Has anybody heard of it before? So at the heart of that novel is a character whose name is Cincinnatus, and he's condemned to death right from the very beginning. But one of the things that he doesn't know is when the sentence is going to be carried out. And in the course of the novel, right, he is depicted, basically as a character who is waiting for his sentence to be carried out. And one of the conversations that we had with that class is that Cincinnatus's position, right, is no different from any other person. It seems extreme to us because he knows that he's going to be beheaded. He knows the nature in which he's going to die. However, he shares with the rest of us the uncertainty about when this death sentence is going to strike. And in that sense, right, nothing has changed fundamentally when it comes to death sending advanced warning letters in order to announce bless you to people when they're going to die. The only thing that changes is that our uncertainty about the date seems to free us from our fear of consequence. So I would have loved to teach Nabokov to you, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So if you can read it on your own time, you might find it interesting. So we talked about the fact that, of course, the conditions under which people die seem to have changed, but once again, they don't seem to sort of lead to any kind of moral improvement. Instead, it seems that once again, even the news of, even the advanced warning about when we're going to die seems to once again undermine our moral principles and inhibitions rather than reinforce them. In this case, however, the letter that Death sends to one of her victims is returned, and it's not returned once, it is returned twice. So let's talk a little bit about the cellist. We said that the cellist is, his occupation is significant. Why do you think that might be the case? I'm looking at this side of the class, which seems to have opted out of talking to me at all. So who wants to speak up?
We talked about how he's an artist.
Yes.
And that artists have, I'm still, I guess, maybe trying to understand all of that.
Yeah.
About what Saramago is saying about artists, that the artists are have an unusual capability of not overcoming death, but well, I mean in this specific case, but I guess in a way overcoming death.
Yeah. Yeah. He seems to be the only one who is immune to death. Everyone else is dying. Yet it is the cellist, right, who is of course a musician, that seems to be immune to death. The fact that he's an artist, of course, is significant, but he is, of course, a musician, which is something that we're eventually going to talk about a lot more closely. We're going to read a passage that describes him from the point of view of the musical piece that he loves, which becomes his musical portrait, which I think is going to be really interesting for us to understand. Having said that, we do have a portrait, a description of the cellist, which is on page, let's see, I think 156 and then again on 169. So why don't we read those passages together? Can someone read it to us starting on page 156, beginning with, there was no doubt about it. So who wants to read that for us? Middle of page 156.
There was no doubt about it. The name agreed with that on the envelope. So did the address. The person's profession was given as cellist, and the space for civil status was blank. A sign that he was neither married, widowed, nor divorced. Because in death's files, the status of bachelor is never recorded. Well, you can imagine how silly it would be for a child to be born, an index card filled out, and to note down not his profession, because he wouldn't yet know what his vocation would be, but that the newborn civil status was bachelor. As for the age given on the card that Death is holding in her hand, we can see that the cellist is 49 years old. Now, if we needed proof of the impeccable workings of Death's archives, we will have it now when, in a tenth of a second, or even less, before our own incredulous eyes, the number 49 is replaced by 50. Today is the birthday of the cellist whose name is on the card. He should be receiving flowers, not a warning that in a week's time he'll be dead. Death got up again, walked around the room a few times, stopped twice as she passed the site, opened her mouth as if to speak or ask a question, or ask an opinion or issue an order, or simply to say that she felt confused, upset, which we must say is hardly surprising when we think how long she has done this job without.
Great, let's stop there because these sentences obviously are interminable. So at some point we have to stop. What did we say about the cellist based on this description? What do we know about him based on this description, and how are these facts relevant to the story?
It seems like it's kind of the first time she's realized, or she's like kind of questioning whether it makes sense or like it's right for this person to die at this
Mhm.
moment. Like it seems like it's been very like, well, it's time for like every single person before that, but now she's like kind of a lot more reflective on it than she's ever been before.
Yeah, in other
She,
words,
like notices like personal details about him.
in other words, she seems to, well, come face to face with her victim, one of her victims, perhaps for the first time, and she's shocked, right? She's shocked that someone has been able to, well, defeat her power and escape it, if only temporarily. What do we learn about the cellist himself?
He's unmarried, without kids,
Yes.
and he's 50. He just turned 50.
Yeah, so one of the things that we learn on the next page is that he was fated to die at 49, right? Yet somehow he's able to defeat death, and on the day of his birthday, when he receives the letter, he's actually able to turn 50. So why is he unmarried? Why does he have no children? Why does he turn 50? We covered some of that territory. Does anybody remember what we said? Death is the 36. The cellist is 50. So, yeah.
I think it says something about like 50 being kind of like you're reaching more into adulthood. It's kind of halfway through life, but like
Mhm.
it's like too young to die.
Right.
So it's like this threshold, like with death,
Mhm.
he's on this threshold of 36, and he's on this threshold of 50.
Yeah, so we talked about the fact that death at 36 has reached sort of the pinnacle, right, of, well, human existence. She is both at the pinnacle of human vitality, right, and fertility, and seems to be at the peak of life. But we also talked about the fact that the peak is already, right, the beginning of a decline. I think I used the metaphor of a fruit that is at the peak of ripeness, which is already in the process of, well, decomposing and decaying. So in other words, the death age already seems to suggest that she embodies, right, that connection, the continuity between life and death. We saw with Ivan Illich that, of course, the misfortune that befalls him at the peak of life. This notion that being able to sort of reach the peak of life is to enjoy all of human powers of vitality and intellectual, well, curiosity, as well as physical ability. But the peak already implies that there is no place to go but down. So when it comes to the cellist, because he's turning 50, right, we might suggest that he's middle-aged, right? In fact, he seems to have crossed from middle age into the next stage of life, the stage of life which is called aging. However, in spite of the fact that he is in the process of aging, it seems that from the vantage point of death, he is still too young to die. In other words, he's both young and old at the same time. He is middle-aged, and yet he is still too young to die. So he embodies, right, that stage between youth and old age. He seems to exist in that liminal space between being young, right, and being old. He's somewhere in between. So why is it that Saramago chooses an artist who is, well, single, and an artist who turns 50 in order to be the only person in the novel who can defy death?
Well, okay, I'm totally just thinking out loud. But
Good.
When we were talking about like Ivan Illich, we were talking about how his surrender of self ultimately had to do, like his selflessness had to do with his family.
Yeah.
And choosing recognizing the pain and suffering he was causing in them
Yeah.
by holding on. And so I think like that's the significance in the cellist, is that he doesn't have anyone except for, you know, his dog that he's leaving behind, so he doesn't
Yeah.
have a reason to, like, I don't know, recognize that. And then also, in terms of being an artist, just I think what Daniel was saying before, we were talking about the difference that, like, I don't know where this necessarily fits in, but that artists can reveal to us, to people, that which is death, and philosophers reveal to us life or something.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. So, in other words, right, it seems that cellist existence is, lonely, right? It is isolated. He seems to live a life of almost complete solitude. The only companion that he has is his dog. However, right, in spite of that, it seems that his life also has, a significant sense of meaning and purpose, and that has to do with his vocation as an artist and as a musician. I think I told you that Schopenhauer, in his magnum opus, talked about artists as being sort of ambassadors, right? As being sort of in the avant-garde of human pursuit of self-knowledge and self-understanding. He talked about the idea that artists are able, because of their ability for heightened imagination, to understand the nature of existence, to understand the nature of life, to understand that ultimately life is, painful, and that the only way to be able to liberate ourselves from the pain and suffering of existence is to cease to desire. However, rather than embracing that solution, rather than ultimately following the sort of the ascetic or a saint, artists choose to return back to the realm of ordinary everyday experience and to share that message with the rest of us. In other words, artists who create works of art that reveal to us the essence of human existence are ultimately martyrs, right, for Schopenhauer. They understand the truth about the nature of human existence, but rather than selfishly extinguish their own pain and suffering, they choose to endure it. And they choose to endure it for the sake of humanity as a whole. So I think something similar might be said about this particular artist. And the fact that he's a musician, I think, is going to become even more significant. So I said a lot. Questions or comments? So Schopenhauer sneaks his way back in. One of the things that we need to talk about is, of course, the surprising revelation that Death and her victim fall in love with each other. Not only, I think, is it surprising that Death is capable of falling in love, it is also, of course, extremely unusual to imagine, a passionate relationship between a human being and his own death. So we will need to, of course, spend quite a bit of time trying to understand that relationship. But before we do, why don't we turn to another passage which describes the cellist on page 169. So who wants to read that for us? It starts at the bottom of page 168, and it begins with, the man looks older than his 50 years. So who wants to read that for us?
The man looks older than his 50 years, or perhaps not older. Perhaps he's merely tired or sad. But this we will only know when he opens his eyes. He has lost some of his hair, and much of what remains is already white. He's a perfectly ordinary man, neither ugly nor handsome. Looking at him now, lying on his back, his striped pajama jacket exposed by the turned-down sheet, no one would think he was first cellist in one of the city's symphony orchestras, that his life runs between the magical lines of the pentagram, perhaps, who knows, searching for the deep heart of the music, pause, sound, systole, diastole. Still annoyed by the failure of the state's postal communication systems, but not as irritated as when she arrived. Death looks at the man's sleeping face and thinks vaguely that he should be dead, that the heart being protected by his left hand should be still and empty, frozen forever in the last contraction. She came to see this man, and now that she has Now that she has, there's nothing sufficiently special about him to explain why a violet-colored letter was returned 3 times. The best she can do after this is to return the cold, subterranean room whence she came, and to discover a way of resolving this wretched stroke of fate that has turned this scraper of cellos into a survivor of himself.
Wonderful. So, how does this description shed new light on the cellist? Or, well, does it?
The thing that stands out to me is just that she sees him as an average guy.
Yeah. Why does that stand out to you? Can you tell us more?
I mean, it makes me think of Ivan Ilyich.
Wonderful. Yeah. Can somebody else continue that thought? I think Daniel's in the right track. So the cellist does not appear to be a hero, right? Nor is he an anti-hero. He seems to be an average human being. It is precisely his, average looks, right, and the fact that he's middle-aged, that seems to suggest that he is similar to Ivan. But what is the one significant detail that makes him different from Ivan?
He's an artist.
He's an artist, right? He's a cellist, he plays for the symphony. Why does that set him apart?
Because therefore he has meaning and purpose. He's a creator, or he brings something useful or something
Yeah.
important to others. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just throwing stuff out here.
Do you want to respond, Daniel? Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking that there's, even though Death is saying seems average, there's an individuality, I think, to what he does as a musician.
Mm-hmm.
When he's the soloist, there's like sort of spotlight put on him when he's playing.
Yeah. So we'll talk about his solo performance, which is unusual, right? Usually he is a part of an orchestra, and we'll talk about the orchestra itself, right, and the role that the cellist plays in it. In other words, cellos are rarely featured. I don't know if you go to the symphony, right, but it's very rare to have a solo, right, performed by a cellist, violinist, pianist, perhaps, maybe even, I don't know, woodwind instruments, but it's extremely rare for a cellist to have center stage and to perform a solo. So, and he's not a composer, right? He does not create music, he merely performs it, right? He merely performs music that has been created by others. And ultimately his life resembles a life of, monotony and repetition, right? It's all about playing the same pieces over and over and over again, and playing them, of course, to audiences night after night. So from that point of view, I think we already have some possible objections to the idea that he is an individual in the sense that we have been describing. So are we then giving up on that theory? Are we ready to discard it? Or do we want to try to?
Well, it feels like even though he's not the composer or creator of this music, again, I feel like I'm kind of going out on a limb maybe, but like he perpetuates the existence of these things. He's almost like a storyteller, and in that he continues to tell us stories that have previously been written, and he's like therefore passing down information or something along those lines of like keeping these things alive, I guess.
So I like that idea. In other words, there's a sense, right, of continuity. In other words, these great works of art are kept alive by people like the cellist, by those who study those works, who love them, and who are willing, to recreate them for us. So in other words, the cellist recreates these beautiful works of art every night. He's not merely repeating them. He's not merely creating a copy of a previous performance, which might transform his activity into something that is monotonous, repetitive, and devoid of originality. Instead, each performance becomes a recreation of a work of art. He breathes new life into that work of art and is able, right, to bring it to life for the audience night after night. What are some of the other things that we might say in response to this idea that I just introduced?
Well, death and the cellist are kind of mirroring each other because
Nice.
death has like this bureaucratic view of death, and it's like something that she does every day, but it like has meaning to the specific people.
Wonderful.
And the cellist is doing that, but like with life, he's
Yeah.
repeating the same thing, but it has meaning to the people who are viewing it.
Excellent. So in other words, they seem to be mirror images of each other, which might suggest, right, why Saramago creates a relationship specifically between these two characters. Death is engaged in a repetitive, monotonous task of killing. The cellist is engaged in a repetitive or seemingly repetitive and monotonous task of, playing the same classical pieces over and over again. Yet, we said that death in her existence is devoid of any meaning and purpose, whereas the cellist's existence seems to be the opposite of that. So mirror image, right? An identical opposite. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Just that comment about them mirroring each other made me think about how like they both really have like a fascinated audience.
Mm-hmm.
Like even if she doesn't find her work interesting, there's like a human obsession with what she does, and that's like very similar to like any art form.
Yeah, I agree with you. So we have to talk about why specifically music, right? Why music and not visual art, not performance art, theater, for instance, or literature for that matter. I mean, Saramago could have been biased and made this character a writer, but he chooses instead to make him a musician. So any ideas why? Why not a writer? Why a musician in particular? What is it about music specifically that becomes important to Saramago?
I don't know, just thinking how like music is like you can only listen to it as it's like playing. You can't like books and like writing and like even paintings kind of like stay like still, while like music is like every moment.
Excellent, excellent. So in other words, music, of course, like other mediums, right? But specifically, more importantly, music unfolds in time, right? In fact, music and musical composition has often been used as a metaphor for what is called temporality, right? What does the term temporality mean? What are we talking about when we talk about temporality?
Is it like how things are only exist for a short period of time, where like everything ends, kind of? Trying to remember the exact definition of temporal. And I'm also like going down this hole with like music of being like every song has a death.
Yeah.
The way that a life
I like that.
exists.
Wonderful.
So
Great.
that's like where I've come to.
Excellent.
Is how music sort of fits into this, and how it's like
Yeah.
it has a life of its own in that short span of which it's played.
Wonderful. So one of the things that we could say is that, of course, music exists in time, right? A musical performance has a beginning, middle, and end. And because of that, it is finite. Yet, it also consists of an infinite number of moments, right? It is simultaneously change, right, as well as continuity. In other words, the notes succeed themselves, and because of that, a musical composition consists of, fleeting moments in time. And of course, it is also, irreversible, right? As the musical composition unfolds, time also continues to move forward. However, in spite of the fact that each note in and of itself only exists for a brief second, right? The musical composition itself has continuity. Not only that, right? It seems to have wholeness, unity, and harmony, something that can only be experienced in the course of time. And as Zeus has pointed out, this can be seen as a metaphor for life itself, right? In other words, life seems to consist of, an infinite number of discontinuous moments, right? Moments that as soon as we become aware of them and say now have already been relegated to the past. Yet, like a musical composition, it seems to also contain, a sense of continuity that makes these moments cohere, that allows us to be able to make sense of these moments and maybe to be able to find in this infinite collection of ephemeral moments a sense of meaning, right? And maybe even a sense of, permanence.
I also feel like there's a significance in that he's, and I know I previously stated this when we talked about this a bit, but I think that there's a significance in the fact that like he is a part of an orchestra, so he's
Yes.
a part of a whole, and he also isn't a composer. So like he's playing things that I've already said this, but I feel like in